Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. As you know, with the camera person right there in the video, we're going to record the meetings now. I want to thank the folks who came from NAACP last meeting, making the recommendation that although we were taking notes and minutes, sometimes it's easier for folks to get back and have a posted recording. So we're doing that going forward with all our meetings going forward. Also, too, we've added a Facebook page. We've come into the social media light. We have a Facebook page for Law Enforcement Council. We didn't put your bios, and we're not going to, your bios or anything out on the Facebook page. I mean, your names will be there so folks will know you're on the council, but we're not going to put your bios and things like that. They can get them to obviously search or ask us, but we didn't put that on the Facebook page, but that's out there as well. And then lastly, we're going to start, we'll talk more in detail about it a little later, public listening sessions. So we're going to go to various colleges, universities, other public spaces to hear from the public on our preliminary recommendations. Obviously, you know the preliminary ones we submitted to the governor on March 17th. Those will be reviewed by him as well, but we want to make sure that the input from the public and the community gets heard and their voices is present as well. So we'll start those listening sessions, and Karen will talk a little bit more about that as well. As we move forward, I just want to thank you for your work. I mean, it's been, I want to say 8 sessions now that we've been together, not including committee meetings. So thank you for your continued work on this. As you know, there's a legislative session still happening in the process. So a lot of the bill, in particular we talked about the training bill from Representative Cornish, is in the process of is an omnibus bill in the Public Safety Committee that's being heard in Conference Committee. We'll hear more about that as it goes along. So right now there's nothing new to report. But when it's time to report on that, we will as well. So I want to thank you for your patience in that area. The other thing I want to do is give you a message from the governor. He fully supports and thanks you again for your work that you're doing here as well. When you talked about the bills that are being considered around public safety, he really wants to hear from this council too around your thoughts and opinions, and that's going to drive his decision making as well. Obviously, it won't be the sole thing that drives it, but he definitely wants to hear your input and feedback related to the training bill in particular as well. So he thanks you for that. Let's do this. There's some new people in the room, so they may not know who all is on the council, what organizations you represent. Let's do this. Let's go around the room and have an introduction. And I will say this, we're missing some people today. We scheduled this meeting at the same time as a law enforcement conference, Chiefs meeting, right? It's happening right at the simultaneously to this meeting. So we're missing some of those folks today, but obviously they're still active participants on the committee. So I'm James Burrows. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer for the state of Minnesota, and I'm with the Office of Governor Mark Dayton, and I'm one of the ex officio members of the council.
I'm Sarah Klein. I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Project, and I'm here representing the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits.
I am Ann Mulholland. I'm Vice President for Community Impact at the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundation, and I'm here on behalf of Minnesota Community Foundation.
And I'm Jane White-Schneeweiss, and I'm with Karen, one of the facilitators for this group, and I'm with the Dispute Resolution Center.
I am Danny Flaherty. I'm with the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association.
Tony Carter, Ramsey County Commissioner, and here representing the Association of Minnesota Counties.
I'm Dante Hollett. I represent the Minnesota Youth Council.
My name is Bob Hawkins, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety.
Karen DeYoung, one of the facilitators.
Yusef Mjani with the Minnesota Dakota Area Conference, NAACP.
I'm W.C. Jordan. I'm president of the Minnesota Dakotas Area State Conference of the NAACP.
I'm Clarence Castile. I'm representative of the Castile family, the Philando Castile family.
I'm Anthony Hines. I'm president of the local chapter of the National Black Police Officers Association, here representing the Latino Association, Asian Association, and the Somali Association.
My name is Scott Johnson. I'm the police chief of the city of Grand Rapids, and I co-chair this committee along with Hennepin County Judge Pam Alexander, and I don't think Pam's able to make it here today.
Right, but she had an emergency hearing today, so she wasn't able to make it. So. Get everybody? And I'd be remiss if I didn't do this, so this will be public record for years to come. David Collier, who's my aide, it's his birthday today. We're not going to sing happy birthday, but we still want to. So your birthday Senate will forever live in Delaware Rapids. I want to turn it over now to Karen DeYoung and let her take over from here.
Yeah, so we just can go briefly through the agenda that we'll be following. According to the agenda, we will have a session of community engagement, and during that time, it'll be an opportunity for community members to share whatever it is that they would like to share. We're asking to keep that to a 3-minute period, and I'll be tracking that to some degree. So we're going to do that, and then followed by Jane. But we've asked, actually, Jane needs to leave early, so we're going to have her talk about the whole process of coming to consensus and how we will be incorporating community feedback into the report. And then we'll have the small work groups under the bulleted points, the criminal justice, et cetera. Work groups will be working on the initial report, working toward a more final report, a break, and then coming back together at the end. So with that, I'm going to ask Jane to come up and present.
Well, my name is Jane White Schneeweiss, and I'm one of the facilitators fortunate enough to do this work with Karen. And in just a minute, all of you that came to speak will have an opportunity to do that. And everyone that comes here has their story. And all of that is important. When the work groups go into their work groups, we hope that you will take those voices. We're starting to do the community, much more engaged part of the community next week. We need your voices. Obviously, the secret to all of this is forming relationships and coalitions. And one of the things that I ask you to do, you're going to be sharing your story, basically. And we all have an investment in this emotionally. It has to happen for our world. It has to happen in our community. And one of the things I want to share is really briefly my story. I've been a mediator and a facilitator for years. And my husband and I raised a son who ended up majoring in college in peace studies. So we raised a kid, no guns, no this, no peace studies. He's been in South Africa. Everybody is equal, all of that. And a number of years ago, our daughter came home and decided she was going to marry a police officer. Well, talk about I was never raised with military. I was never raised around guns. I was never raised around any of that world. But how many of you in this room are a parent? How many of you, if you're not a parent, have a mother? Okay, I'm a mom. And if you think about it, we follow our children. I look at you here, Clarence. We follow this because we have some personal stake in this. I want a world for my grandchildren, for my children. I want a world that works and communities that work. And so what I asked the committee to do when they get together is, from what we've heard, people are working really well together. They're taking this seriously. It's very important to them to get it right. We need the input and we need your feedback. And we hope that the group will take what we are going to hear today and take that back into the group. And the other thing to remember is we all are aware to some degree that there are limitations on government. I wish, I'd like it to be 75 and sunny every day, but that just isn't going to happen. So I want you to be very realistic, and from what we hear with the groups and the feedback, that's happening. But also remember with that, because I'm an incredibly optimistic person, that this is just a step. This is just the beginning. So much else has to happen, but don't discount that. And so we ask when you go into your groups, it sounds like you're working really well. Take these voices that you're going to hear today and the ones that we're going to hear next week and speak for all of us. We're the ones that elect the officials, and so we ask that you continue to do that. And from much of the work that Karen and I have done, we've had wonderful feedback from the people on this committee. They really do want to get it right. So I thank you all, and at this point, I like what Karen said, is everybody has about 2 or 3 minutes, and please, we wish we could give everybody an hour, but think of all the people and think of all that have shown up here today, and please give everyone an opportunity to speak. And so that's, I ask you just to kind of get up here, tell your story, share what you need to share, and then make room for somebody else. So with that, moving in.
So we'll move into the community input section. I will have you, like where Jane was just standing, And each person will get 2 to 3 minutes, and you may be responding. I'm not sure how many people have seen the recommendation, so you may be responding to the recommendation specifically. You may have something else that you'd like to speak about. But this is your opportunity to do that. Is there anyone who would like to? Yes, please, could you come up if you're able?
You said stand here?
Yes. I don't want your back.
Oh, yeah.
Their
No,
back
no,
to be
no,
to
of
you,
course,
so,
of course.
yeah.
My name is Michelle Gross, and I'm president of the organization Communities United Against Police Brutality. We have been, we're a Twin Cities-based organization. We've been working on police accountability for over 17 years, and I personally have worked on police accountability for over 30. What I wanted to talk about just briefly is the initial recommendations that have come out. Our organization prepared a response to those. I'm hoping that you received that response. Yes? No?
I don't.
I submitted it to David shortly after your initial recommendations.
We've got note takers, so we'll be sure to follow up on that.
Okay, so that's the.
Yeah.
What's important to us, and you know, what I noted was that the initial recommendations are fairly vague. They're not super duper concrete, and I expect that's probably normal for this point in your process, and that's understood. But at the same time, what's important to us is that the things that you recommend are evidence-based. For example, there's an awful lot of talk about things like implicit bias training. New studies are showing that, for example, implicit bias training, the best implicit bias training is at best only effective for 24 hours, and most training, not even that. So implicit bias training is turning out to be a big bomb. However, explicit bias training actually does work. And so it would be important to actually, again, work on evidence-based best practices, not just, you know, kind of things that feel good. Another very good example, and again, I'll try to keep it brief, is body cameras. Everybody in the world was talking about body cameras and how great they're going to be for police accountability. Our organization was literally the only organization that's recognized nationally that said we did not think body cameras were the answer. We were the group that was very far out front on that position. Everybody else thought we were nuts. Turned out we were right, because guess what? The community can't access the footage, so therefore they're not a good accountability tool. And they never were designed to be that, frankly, anyway. So we need to be thinking about things that actually work. And so some of the kinds of things we talked about are a separate prosecutorial office that takes responsibility for both investigations and prosecutions in critical incidents, police critical incidents, things like professional liability insurance for police, things that will actually have the intended effect. So our organization just wishes to ask you to concentrate on those areas that will actually bring about real accountability and change in policing, which is what we believe in the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, did you want to respond?
I'm so sorry.
Just she said so fast, I don't remember where she's from.
I'm from Communities United Against Police Brutality,
Okay.
Twin Cities-based organization.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to comment from the community? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Kevin Gertis, and I'm the director for the Master of Public Affairs. I also teach a public safety leader course for executive leaders, mid-career leaders who are in public safety, fire, police, EMS. And we've had 4 years of that course offering it to leaders. And last December, I got a group of people together who assembled as part of our leadership and management area at the Humphrey School to explore this idea of community and police relationships. And what can we do? Rather than be a bystander, we at the University of Minnesota wanted to find a role that we could play. And so we brought a diverse group of people together to talk about how we might do something to help advance this cause, to help increase understanding, to help improve trust. And we have not settled on what we want to do, but we've had 6 months of monthly meetings with a growing group of people who are interested in doing something. We don't want to be redundant to what's already happening in a task force like this and also out in communities, but we want to add to and enhance and augment or complement some of those efforts. So I just wanted to make you aware of it. We've been following the Governor's Task Force, the Governor's Council's recommendations, and we're now engaged to the point where we want to perhaps host some forum events with community and police leaders to come together with students and faculty and members of the community to perhaps explore the implementation of some of the recommendations that might come out of this council. So I just want to make you aware of that, and if there is a way that we could be support or augment or complement the efforts of this council, we just want to make you aware of that. So, thank you.
Do you want to, you have not sent anything, I'm wondering whether you could give your contact information
Sure.
to one of them so that they can want to follow up. Thank you. Any other feedback from community members? Yes. Bill?
Good to see you again, Karen.
You too, Bill.
My name is Bill Woodson. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota. I'm actually on part of the team that Kevin just made reference to. I've also been involved in working on a couple of initiatives around community dialogue with law enforcement. I think it's a multifaceted problem, this challenge of the lack of trust and effective relations between law enforcement and the community. Multifaceted responses may be necessary. I'm a person of action, and and I'm not from a law enforcement background, so my degrees of freedom in terms of how I could engage and make an impact are somewhat limited, but I think I've been able to find some areas where I can make a contribution. One of them is I've been facilitating community dialogues with law enforcement. We've had 3 that I've had the opportunity to be facilitator for. One was at First Covenant Church in Minneapolis on the 24th of August. We've also had 2 facilitated conversations in September and October in Brooklyn Center and in Brooklyn Park. And I think this opportunity to create space for ordinary citizens and community leaders to engage face-to-face with law enforcement leaders and representatives to humanize both sides and to give space for questions about how is law enforcement supposed to happen when we see these kinds of dynamics occurring. And I'm not just talking about the clear fatalities and injuries and unnecessary arrests, but just in terms of when a police officer shows up and or maybe the words seem rude, or young people encounter law enforcement and their first impulse may be to run. Like, what's going on behind the scenes, and how can we learn more about each other and take down those blinders where we just see a blue uniform, or we just see a kid with his pants hanging behind his butt, and we say, "Oh, I know what that's about," and we can see past that to the humanity that we all share, and also we can impart some wisdom and knowledge so that people can better navigate those interactions. And I'm talking about both for the community to better navigate those interactions, show up in a way that maybe puts law enforcement more at ease, and also that lets law enforcement maybe understand when they see certain kinds of behavior that may look like they might associate with criminality, it could just be fear and nervousness. And so we're actually holding another one of these events, a community dialogue, and this is going to be with high school students and law enforcement officers. I'm targeting to engage 75 officers and 75 high school students, and we have room also for 20 or 30 community members. So this is an invitation to that event. It'll be at North High School at June 1 from 10 to 3. And it's also an invitation for those who want to be a part of maybe helping identify people who would benefit from being a part of that conversation, or for people who think they have something to say to that collective group. We're looking to not just have experiences that will help inform both sides about the dynamics, but also some opportunity to work in small groups and brainstorm possible solutions and approaches and strategies that could help everyone be safer together. In fact, the name of the event is Safer Together, Urban Youth and Law Enforcement. So I'm available in the back. I have some business cards if people want to be a part of that process or want to support that process. If they'd like to financially support that process, we got a gap, so we can talk about that too. But I just want to make people aware that there's an opportunity to create space for conversation, and it's not the solution. There's no one solution, but I think it's an important part. Thanks for the
Thank you. Others? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. So the next thing on our agenda, thank you all for participating, and those of you who came up and sharing your insights, your upcoming events, and your perspectives. I appreciate it. The next thing on our agenda is for the work groups to break into the small groups for the work groups. So those of you who may not have an agenda, it's criminal justice and social reform, police training, law enforcement, workplace and policy oversight, diversity recruitment and retention, community and law enforcement health and wellness, and police policy development and implementation. So there are a lot of people missing this time, so hopefully we'll still be able to make some progress in terms of the agenda for the meeting for this small group work will be to take the initial report and work on the recommendations for your specific group and try to, as our former Michelle, I think it is, said, sort of add sort of meat to the recommendations and refine them further given feedback. And so the community members are welcome to join as observers to listen in on those groups, but I would ask that if you have questions or comments that you write them down and then give them to our note takers, so that we can incorporate it so that the work groups can continue their conversation. So at this point, I'd ask that the work groups, yes, Commissioner Carter. Yes,
General
please.
question about
Sure.
Recommendations or
Yes.
edits that may have come in afterward?
There
Will
have
they
been
be
no, I
circulated
have not
to-
received, and so for those of you who are in the community, I have been gathering inputs from the council members and incorporating it. I have not received any additional, I think you sent me something since that time, but that's the only feedback that I've gotten.
Okay, so
So
with
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
that
Does
information
that relate
been
to
circulated
community
to the
feedback
groups?
or council members?
that is council, that's specifically council members sending me feedback, which I think is that what you're asking about?
Right, and I'm wondering if I need to do a walk around or if that material was shared.
I have, I just did a document that I'll share with the groups that has a compilation of the feedback that was received from the council members that you can look at. So,
Thank you.
Karen?
Yes.
Do you also have the work group recommendations from the subcommittees?
I do not. Do we have copies of the report, David? Okay.
Because we provided work group recommendations from the Recruitment Retention Committee.
Yes. Was that in addition to what
No, these were-
incorporated into the initial report? Were there additional
Yes.
ones? I think he incorporated your feedback into this.
Mhm.
Yes, so your feedback was incorporated into the initial report, is my understanding. The NAACP feedback.
So
Yes,
you
sir.
you
Yes.
have that?
Yes.
Okay.
So that would be incorporated into the initial one, so there hasn't been any additional feedback since that time. Any other questions or concerns before we break into the small groups? And David's going to try to get copies of the reports, which you guys can refer to. Okay, at this time, I would ask that the work groups break into their small groups and have discussions.
So in the training, police training work group, we discussed the recommendations that we had put forward. And there were 3 areas that we wanted to be clear about. One was that, and this was on the list of comments that I had sent back after the initial report, that the whole umbrella for training recommendations should be focused on developing higher capacity for guardianship. And that was a general recommendation that would go over and across all of those areas of training that we have put forward. We heard a presentation the last time on, what was it? Character-based training. I should know that because it was my county that presented, right?
Mhm.
So we heard that, and there were a number of things that came out of that presentation, and that was one of them, the focus on guardianship. Also in the area of the training, we looked at our recommendation for training on cultural diversity and wanted to be clear that it's probably more about training for cultural competence. So the understanding was that that cultural diversity recommendation was about being sure that officers would be able to engage across cultures in competent manners within communities. And the third thing was that we wanted to be sure there would be some incentive to departments and even to officers for engaging community-led or community-engaged training programs. So certainly there will be contracts for training, And our sense was that the community is asking us, and we need to be responsive to the need for that community-led and/or community-engaged training. So we wanted to make a recommendation for some incentives in that regard. And then we were looking across the other recommendations. We talked a little bit about the other areas, and I just wanted to ask the group to entertain a set of recommendations in the diversity, recruitment, and retention area, and in the criminal justice and social justice reform area also that were included on that input received after the initial recommendations were written. One of those was, of course, to accept the NAACP input, to review that for inclusion, and that input had been provided at our last meeting. That the state should collect information on what's working across the state as best practices and share that information across departments, specifically for recruiting and retaining diverse workforces. I don't have to read through all of these, but would like some consensus from the group today as to whether the recommendations could be added. And our consultant has said that she is being very, very careful not to add things until the group has had the opportunity to talk through them. So I'm hoping that in those areas, in diversity, recruitment, and retention, and also in criminal justice and social justice reform, the groups would have had an opportunity to look over these recommendations. There's a larger set in diversity, recruitment, and retention. And then in the criminal justice and social justice reform, the recommendation was that departments should be supported to develop local and/or collaborative approaches to support police community navigation. And I know many of us have heard about navigators in different areas of our work. Navigators who have affinity to communities, who are able to be contact and communication between the community and between the police department. And so that comment was a recommendation that in some way we are able to support the development of navigators in our community in contact with our police departments. So that's it for the training.
Were you asked, did you have a ask of the group? I couldn't quite figure
I was
if you were
hoping
asking
that
the-
those teams who looked over diversity, recruitment, and retention will have had the opportunity to look through the 8 recommendations that were at the back of the input received. So I'm not sure whether the diversity, recruitment, and retention group got to do that, but that was my question, and whether there was support for those recommendations. I didn't know if I should go through all 8, because certainly that team would have had the opportunity, or maybe did not get the opportunity to. So I'm asking, I believe you were on that team.
Who was on the? Yeah.
We're on that team.
Did you? I'm not sure.
We didn't specifically address these, but we do like them. We went over them for a minute, but there were so many other things that we spoke about that might need to get added as well in the upcoming meeting that we'll have as a group.
Yep.
So these will be with us at that meeting.
Okay, thank you. I want to call your attention to them. I appreciate that you like them and hope that you will adopt them. Thanks. And then the criminal justice and social justice reform team also. The question would be about navigators.
Who was
was
the
our
representative from the social reform, criminal justice? Since we can't get that decision today, then we don't have a representative.
Oh, is that my group?
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm a group of 1 today.
I get it. We'll work on it. Thank you.
And then Commissioner Carter asked me, and I'm speaking only for feedback from the council into the report, so I have not been adding, and James will talk about community input, but I have not been adding, as she said, feedback until I hear from the collective. So I'm not, I have individual people who are sending me things or comments, so I'm turning it back on the group and saying, once you have collectively decided that this is the input you'd like to add, then I will add it to the report. Just so that the process is understood. So.
Quick question.
Yes.
You're talking about training, so it should be the police and the community. Are you suggesting that maybe it should be training for the community and the police are part of the community instead of doing police training? And maybe some community training? What's that?
No, it wasn't. And instead, but that there should be community engaged and or community-led training within departments. We have specific areas, for example, mental health, and clearly the department does not have the expertise, all of the expertise, and that is an opportunity for community engaged training. There's also the cultural competency area, which would be a huge opportunity for community engaged, in fact, community-led training. So it seemed to us that it would be important that we develop those relationships where possible with the community, to see police and officers together with community in engaged or led training opportunities.
The thought I had is so often we've got police training, and then the community might be doing something. Maybe the community's involved in training the police. What if there was training in which both the police and the community together would be trained, and where you could build some relationships and networking? And I thought that might be what
It sounds like you just described my 2-in-1 program. So thank you for the validation.
Any other comments? Another group that would like to share? Yes.
Commissioner Carter, who I love and respect dearly, I'd like to make a recommendation about language because I think it is very important. 54 years ago, I received a certificate that said I was competent at operating a motor vehicle. And all I have had to do since then, every 4 years, is plunk down a check for $25 and look in the goggles and say, these are the letters that I think I see. All diversity means is different. And competence is a one-time fixed measurement, like a driver's license. And I think what we're talking about is cultural proficiency, which requires continuing education. Because 20 years ago, cultural competence meant black-white relationships, then it meant black-white, Latino, then Asian, then American Indian, then Somali, Muslim, Korean, etc. And I think what we're talking about is not just somebody reaching a level and then being static at that level, but dynamically being required to maintain that proficiency, because the community is ever changing. It's not the same community it was 54 years ago when I got my driver's license for the first time, or 5 years ago, the first time I was certified as competent in some other skills. So I think the notion of ongoing training is important, or at least continuing education, so that that person maintains proficiency with the changes that take place naturally in a community. It might be aging, it might be, if you're certified in one community and you move to another, you have an entirely different set of realities that you need to be equipped and proficient in terms of addressing. So I would just suggest proficiency as requiring that continuing education and demonstrated commitment to a particular topic.
I accept that friendly and loving amendment.
Sure. Since Yusef has already talked about the first one, the cultural proficiency training for the chief and administrative staff.
The work group, for those of you who don't know, the work group that you're in.
Oh, my apologies. I am in the work policy and recruitment work group. The long-term is law enforcement, workplace and policy oversight, diversity, recruitment, and retention team.
Love name.
Right. A lot of our discussion focused around what are departments doing about the immigration status of what's going on in the state now, and which chiefs are stepping forward to say that they're not promoting or recommending that agenda for their individual departments. We went on to talk about the psychological evals or tests that adversely affect people of color and women. We also talked about the FTO programs and how the recruit should have an opportunity, if a conflict arises, to seek out the assistance of another FTO. Once we figure out how that verbiage should look, we will dissect it in the work group to see if it's a viable recommendation and how we can word it. Talked about community members being on oral boards. oral boards for hiring, unit assignments, promotions, and things of that nature. We're also trying to get the demographics of the local agencies in the Twin Cities. Isaac's working on that. We also threw around mentorship, which we didn't have a lot of time to speak on, but I think that's an excellent idea for individuals going into departments. How that would look as far as individual departments, but if we can give them some type of groundwork of what type of mentorship we're expecting to retain this individual, I think we'll be on the right path. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask, as I was moving around from group to group and stopped at Sarah's group of one, she made a comment that I asked her to share with a larger group about those of you who attended the last meeting where there was community engagement, community input with a lot of passion. And she just wanted to make sure that we stopped to acknowledge that passion. And you had some thoughts that I thought might be useful to share.
I mean, I think it's important just to, I don't think we've talked about the last meeting where there was a lot of emotion, a lot of raw feelings that were brought forth as far as community feedback. And I think it's important for us as a council to own that and to acknowledge the feelings that community members have. As hard as it is sometimes to hear someone's feedback through anger or frustration, I think there's value in understanding where that comes from and some of the hardships that community members and a wide range of community members have felt in very real situations that have had negative consequences on both sides. I mean, we're here because there have been lives that have been lost, whether it's law enforcement officials or it's family members from the community. And I think we need to take a step back and remember that as we're going through all of this, that we're talking about real people in the community and the humanity of the work that we all do and the importance of understanding that we all have family members, that we all have lives outside of wearing a uniform or being a community member, and to recognize that. And I think Karen, started out with just remembering that these stories that people are telling are really important to how we come to understanding how we come up with these recommendations. And I think giving space for that and really reflecting and taking a step back of where we come at these recommendations, because I think there's been sort of a standstill with a lot of the work that we're doing, and I know even in our work group there's not consensus around our recommendations, and I think we're at a standstill with that. I don't know that we're going to get it to any place where there's mutual agreement that that's a healthy recommendation. And we've also received feedback from other council members that there is no support for some of the recommendations that we're putting forth. And so it makes some of this work really challenging and hard to think about as far as having some really honest conversations. And I think some of that's been missing from the dialogue. All of this has been very respectful, and I think people have shared their personal thoughts and feelings, but I think, I don't know that we've come to the heart of the core issue at hand. And I think that as a council, we have a responsibility to really think about that as far as how we weave that into the work that we're doing and really listening and paying attention to what is at the heart of the hurt, because that's what it is. Anger and frustration comes from a place of hurt. And we have to heal that and recognize that it's important. And I see that in my work every day. I work in domestic violence, and I have a staff that has a lot of hurts because we deal with families that have lost their lives, whole families that have been wiped out at the hands of someone that has committed a horrible crime. And so we see that. And we've also seen law enforcement that have handled that with great care and kindness. And that's important to recognize. And we've also seen the reverse, where I've had staff come back at me and say, this police officer handled this case in a really bad way. And I've had community members in certain areas of the city that we work in that have given us really hard feedback that, as a victim, they've been abused or harassed by the police officer that's taking the report. And so those stories and those reactions and those interactions are real, and we have to acknowledge them. It's not about pointing fingers one way or the other, but it's about where are those opportunities to do better on both sides. And I think that's really part of our work. And I don't know that we're there yet.
I know James says we'll have something to share about the process that you referred to in terms of incorporating when you're in a disagreement, but I do want to see if anyone else wants, before we move to that, to add or comment on anything that you said. Yes.
I'd like to offer a generic comment in support of what the representative from the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits just said. When we're talking about police-community relations, I'm reminded of the reasons why this task force was put together in the first place. Because of what Joe Biden referred to as the breach of trust that existed between law enforcement and communities of color and low-income communities across this country. And when we talk about police-community relations, it's not an equitable relationship, okay? The law enforcement community has far more in the way of resources. In St. Paul, the community policing program is called FORCE, Focus Our Resources on Community Empowerment, a very military-sounding term. And I want to say this to the law enforcement representatives around the table. You can't have your cake and eat it too. It was as a result of Ferguson and Tamir Rice and Staten Island and Cleveland and incidents around the country that low-income communities and communities of color were requesting body cameras for increased transparency and accountability and honesty on the part of law enforcement officials. But if you implement a body camera policy that does not require you to tell people that they're being videotaped and sound recorded, that does not require you to ask for permission when you enter private property, okay, where law enforcement officers have the opportunity to review the video before they make their initial report or statement, it's hard for you then to expect that it's an equitable relationship and you can go to that community and say, trust us, we want to work with you, we want to work together. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You know, you've got to walk the walk, you've got to talk the talk. So when we're talking about law enforcement and police community relations, we're not talking about a public relations campaign. We're talking about a meaningful relationship, one in which both parties have an investment and some ownership and meaningful input, not tell us what you think and then we'll do whatever we please anyhow. So the fact that there is not unanimous support from within the law enforcement community for a lot of the recommendations that are being made by community representatives suggests that it's still about self and kind, because the body camera policies basically are pro-law enforcement. And some departments use them with facial recognition software. Some use them to increase warrantless searches, surveillance. They're not being used for transparency and accountability. So we need to be real honest. You can't do it on Monday and then on Tuesday, you know, it's like playing cards with somebody all weekend. And then Monday morning they get up and leave the table, they got all your money and all the aces fall out of their sleeves and they say, wait a minute. From here on in, we're gonna play fair, you know. We're gonna slip these back in the deck and pretend like it never happened. You gotta start somewhere, and you gotta start with some serious commitment to what the community is really voicing and requesting and representing. And if you can't do that, then it's not a meaningful conversation. There has to be some parity, there has to be some equity, and there has to be some partnership, some mutual benefit and mutual respect. Otherwise, we're just going through the motions. Okay? So I'm okay with the fact that everybody is not unanimous about what's being said, because everybody is not coming from the same perspective and the same social practice and experience. But it has to be an honest conversation, and we have to put the cards on the table, and we have to respect where one another are coming from, or we can come up with some pretty flowery recommendations. We'll get a few crumbs from the legislature, and it will be business as usual for a young man like the youth sitting behind me, who came here from the south side of Chicago and has repeatedly been pulled over and profiled and ticketed and made to feel that every contact he has with the police is going to be an adversarial contact even before it happens. So I understand what you're saying, and I just want us to go back to the reasons why this task force was created in the first place, because a breach of trust did and does and will continue to exist unless we are really honest about putting it on the table and putting our arms around it and trying to work through it. And that's what I think all of the community representatives that I've engaged with want to bring to the table and see happen. Okay? So I've said my piece.
Additional comments? James, do you want to talk about both the two things, both the process for coming to consensus, if you can call it there, so how do the recommendations that go into the final report, when there is that disagreement, what is the process? And I mentioned to him a lot of times when you work with groups, they, at the beginning, come up with a decision-making process that they will be using, whether it be consensus or majority or whatever. So I think James is going to talk about that. And the second piece would be talking about weaving community input, the process for weaving community input to date into the initial report. And then we can talk about moving forward into the report.
Before I go there, let me thank Sarah and also Yusuf for bringing into the room what needs to be in the room. Last meeting was different than all of our other meetings. It wasn't business as usual. It was people with a lot of raw emotion and stories about, you know, their experiences with police and, you know, how it made them feel and the impact it had on them and their community. Those stories in and of themselves don't make up the whole story. We also hear stories from, and I've heard stories along this process of last year from officers' wives, from other communities as well. So, but those are the things we need to talk about. And it's not a bad thing. Somebody asked me about the last meeting, James, did you expect all that? I said, no, I wasn't expecting it, but it's what was needed at that time. From that meeting, we also reached out to the local Minneapolis NAACP because they had a lot of members show up, and they talked about how to better keep the community informed, how to make sure that we're having these discussions, how to make sure that there's a process for informing, but also too a process for valuable community input. Part of those recommendations are why we're doing the listening sessions. Part of those recommendations are why we're videotaping this again, and we're going to be having, you know, every month meetings with that local branch as well as they requested. This is a piece of clay that we are shaping as we move along, and I appreciate everybody's input and feedback, because as we shape it together, it's going to come out with something. What that something is, I have no idea. I've been a brother from Detroit for a long time. I'll be 50 this year, and my experiences with police have been here, they've been here, they've been here, they've been here, but nobody's really talked about them before. Nobody's sat down with both law enforcement and the community at the table saying, how do we work collectively together? So this is a process in that. By no means do you think on June 30th it's going to be this magic wand and the governor's going to say, man, this is great stuff, and I'm going to apply all these 10 things, and the legislature's going to say, you know what, I'm going to give you $10 million, $20 million for it. That ain't going to happen. But what will happen is there may be that one or two things, maybe that one thing. We say, you know what, we can work collectively together on that. Maybe there's more representation on boards like the Post Board. Maybe there's more community input and feedback as far as officers' evaluation interviews. Those are the things that we're getting to in those discussions. That transitions me into your groups, your smaller groups. Now, you all know about consensus, and typically you try to have consensus in groups, and all these personalities in this room, you are intentionally chosen or nominated by your organizations. There's no way I'm expecting consensus on everything that we do. But in your groups, what I would imagine, I hope to see, and I've seen some is, you know, having a full discussion, a robust discussion, but coming up with those things that you can agree about. And a lot of times it's a majority. It's not necessarily all 5 people. I've seen some of the groups here work as 4 people and one person has an outline of view and don't want to be considered. And the recommendations that come forth based upon that majority. Now, what we had the last time was we had a majority on some things and one person had their own individual view and they wanted to put that in the report. If I did that, this report would be 600 pages because it'd be, this is the majority and these are the other people, the other opinions, and these are the other opinions behind the other opinions about that. Ideally, you know, I don't think we can do that, I'll be honest with you. But what we can do is those things that relate to consensus and or majority can come forward from the committee, and then what the Policy Development Implementation Committee would do is help us sift through all these recommendations, say, okay, what are the strategies or implementation strategies we can have for effective implementation of it. So let's say one of them is police training. And let's say we have a bill, which we do, Representative Cornish does, about police training. How do we support that as a group on police training if we can agree upon whether it's explicit bias or implicit bias or a procedural justice, what can be in that bill, and this group can say, you know what, that one thing we can come around a consensus and support. I am by no means naive to think that all the things as recommendations that we're going to get consensus or majority group on. But I know what will happen is this report will circulate throughout the state. This report will circulate throughout the legislature. And there are things that people have a passion about, and they'll say, you know what, here's some data, here's some research on this, here's this council's viewpoint. Maybe I can try this next legislative session. Maybe I can think about doing this and presenting it to the community and also then presenting it to the full legislature. That's the ultimate goal. So when it goes back to how we decide things in your committee, I'm not dictating to you how you decide those things, but what I've seen work for these committees is a majority of folks, taking a vote or however it works, and then come out with those recommendations. Those who have different opinions, they can express those opinions, but we're not going to put those individuals' opinions into the report. Is my thought. Open to discussion. So that sounded like an edict. I don't want to come across that way, but that is made, to me, that makes more sense than trying to put everybody's thoughts in. On the community side of things, to be real clear on the community piece, we've had a lot of community feedback since July 7th. July 7th is when Philando Castile was shot and killed. Since July 7th, we have met with several organizations, we meaning the governor, myself, members of the staff. We met with the legislature, we met with the community. We've got a lot of feedback. We've got people to send in reports as well. I have not brought to you everything that we've received, but we have brought to you, I think it's the first document you received. It's kind of a synthesis of what we had heard at that time. Remember the document that got me in trouble? I sent it out because people thought it was everything that we should be doing, and it wasn't. It was just that we had heard at that point, and we'll continue to do that. So as we get community feedback and input, I'll continue to bring that to the table. I'm not inclined to, unless you want me to submit everything we get to you to review, but making sure that those things are heard. I think the community mentioned earlier recommendations about special prosecutor's office and recommendations about liability insurance for police. Those are things that were mentioned in that first document you received, because that's what we heard from community. So we're making sure that you hear all those ideas and thoughts, although you won't receive every single document. If you want that to change, feel free to let me know that. That'll be fine, but that's what we try to do to synthesize it. From a community standpoint, I want community to understand that this is not just to inform the community. We really want your feedback and input, because the people around this table and those that aren't here today will take that and go back to those groups and discuss, hey, how do we incorporate this? So this is something that should be done. I love the fact that Tony came up with the item she had to share with her fellow committee members who are in another group. Say, hey, these are some things you can consider. Tony?
So, just wanted to ask a question about the process of community engagement and input. How does that flow? Is this a meeting that will share with the attendees the recommendations as they exist today and ask for feedback or input so that input can come to us then to help review and discuss what we've done and perhaps make changes? Or is it raw input, community coming to make statements? I just am curious as to how we use that and synthesize that.
Good question. It's a both and. So, two things. One is we're actually going to bring on a consultant to facilitate the meetings, who's familiar with community engagement, has done that, and an expert in that. Because I don't want it to seem like it's the governor's office telling you what to do, how to say it. Some people just are intimidated just by that process. But that person or persons will present, here are the recommendations as they currently exist, and identify and tell people, these are not final recommendations, these are not recommendations that can't be changed, we want to receive your feedback. So ideally, category by category based upon the recommendations, and folks can give input in those categories. But also, too, you're not limited to that. If it's something that you don't see up there, it's another group that you would consider you want to be involved, there's another group that we're missing, or another recommendation, we want to have that as well. But the easiest frame, I think, to start with is the preliminary recommendations, and have people give feedback on that. And they may say, you know what, I don't like any of those, here are some more. So give people that freedom and flexibility. And from the council standpoint, that will come back to you in two forms. It'll be written up in a document as well, but we'll also maintain the raw footage, audio footage as well, so you to take a listen to as well. So we want to make sure that you get that feedback. And also, too, the goal is to come up with other mechanisms, not just to be physically there. So we haven't figured it out yet. We're going to. Like, how do people either email or post on a blog or somewhere if they can't physically make the meetings, but their voice is still heard. So that's something we will have announced by the first meeting as well, but that's something we want to do as well.
And of course, then the Facebook page is great. We need to make sure it's updated with dates of upcoming meetings and all of those input
We
sessions.
definitely do that. Definitely.
I would just a little bit of a amendment to that, and just because of the time, time being of the essence, that there is the first community meeting a week from Monday, which will be at Augsburg College at 3 o'clock, and I don't know the room.
4 p.m.
Oh, 4 p.m., I'm sorry, 4 p.m. Do we know the room?
Yeah, it's going to be in the auditorium, the Citizen Auditorium on Augsburg campus. So 4 to 7 p.m. Augsburg campus.
And we will, I think we already have, posted that on the site. And also too, we'll send it out to the members as well. We also are working, like I said, with, we'll post on the Facebook page, and we're also working with community organizations to get it out to their members as well. So.
Are you asking members of the council will be at those meetings?
I am. It's not, I said it that way. I would love for all of you to be there. I don't expect all of you to be there. We're going to have more meetings. I would love for a representative group of you to be there so you can physically hear as well. We'll make sure you get the information regardless, but I'd love for you to be there to interact with people, talk to people who have had different experiences, and they can talk to you as members of the council as well. So you're going to be invited to all of the meetings. The expectation is not that you attend all of them, but I would love for you all to be in attendance.
FYI, I attend the Thompson Gupta forums over at Augsburg, and 4 o'clock is rush hour. Parking is atrocious. And in terms of any future community engagement sessions that you have, I'd encourage you to look at transportation and parking as critical pieces in terms of community engagement, because Augsburg is just, it's real frustrating. A lot of people go over there for meetings and can't find a place to park and wind up driving back home. It's just, it's tough. And I don't say that with any kind of malice, just that if you can find future meetings that are close to Green Line, that have free parking, that are more accessible, I think there's a greater opportunity for input from the community.
Okay. We definitely will do that. And now that you said that, we will keep it there way first. But I know they have some lots over there that they say private on them, like Lot C, or like for Augsburg, like private for contract parking and other stuff. What I'm going to do is ask them for some spaces for the meeting as well. So now that I know that, I'm going to ask them for those spaces. So we'll make sure that we get that into the information as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
And so the preliminary plan is that first meeting in the Twin Cities a week from Monday, so the first. Another meeting in the Twin Cities, and then 2 in outstate Minnesota, yet to be determined. I don't think there's been any decision on that, so if the council has feedback on where those locations might be, that's my understanding from Omer.
This coming Monday's the first. You mean a week?
Yes, a week from, yes, this coming Monday at 4 o'clock.
Oh,
is
the
first
May
meeting.
1st?
Yes.
So
At
it's
Augsburg.
I mean, that's a major holiday for a lot of people.
Oh,
So that's pretty surprising.
okay. Any other comments or questions about anything that's been said so far? So in closing, I think there are 2 tracks, one being finishing up or continuing to work on this next iteration of the report and incorporating the additional feedback from the council, making the recommendations more robust. And there are copies of the first initial draft report, as well as the compilation of feedback from council members out here on the table. The second track is kind of as the report's being worked on, the community engagement piece that we've talked about, where those recommendations are presented to community members. And obviously we're not going to have a final report until they've had a chance to respond to the recommendations. And again, keeping in mind, I know the individual, some of the groups are further along than others, but the idea is to have a final report at the end of June. So if the work groups could meet together and please feel free to contact me if I can be helpful in any way in facilitating a meeting or working with the chair or whatever to move the process forward. Please feel like you can do that. That's part of my role. But it would be nice to have middle of, or by the end of May, to have feedback. I'm looking to you, James, to see, working backwards from the end of June, if we could get council final for them recommendations by the end of May, and then additional.
Let's talk through that.
Okay.
It depends on active engagement of the committees and giving them enough time. So I'm going to talk to the chairs first.
Okay.
To kind of work on that timeline.
Okay.
I will say this, to reiterate what Karen said, if there are things going in your committee group that aren't going as well as could be, reach out to Karen. We'll make sure that we'll supply you with either resources, recommendations, or other bodies of people with knowledge around that particular subject. We have a lot of committees, and if we don't communicate to each other what's going on in them, and it may not be as productive as you want it to be, but we're here as a resource. We have that resource through Karen. We have other resources we can reach out to. So just please let us know as far as your committees are either working good or not. Some things we need to work on. We can definitely support that.
Are there other additional things that people want to add to? We're ending early, which I'm sure people won't complain about, but that was all we had for our agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you.
That's it. We need a fifth member.